She told him to hide his necklace, without realizing the quiet man in front of her was Keanu Reeves. But when he refused, what unfolded mid-flight silenced the cabin, challenged everything she believed, and sparked a moment the internet would never forget. What did he say that changed the entire plane? Keep watching to find out. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The terminal buzzed with its usual chaos at Los Angeles International Airport. Children tugged rolling backpacks, business travelers barked into Bluetooth headsets, and tourists snapped last-minute photos of departure boards. But in the middle of that noise, one man moved like still water, calm, unhurried, almost invisible. He wore a black t-shirt, loose at the shoulders, faded jeans frayed slightly at the hem, a pair of old sneakers that had long since lost their original shine. There was no designer bag, no assistant pacing beside him, no rush in his steps. Around his neck hung a small silver crucifix, modest, unpolished, and slightly dulled by time. It glinted briefly as he passed under the terminal lights. Most people didn't give him a second glance, and those who did paused, squinted, wondered, could it be? But he was already walking past, carrying nothing but a worn canvas duffel and a quiet presence that seemed out of place in a setting designed for spectacle. He didn't check his phone, didn't look for attention. He just moved with purpose, like someone who had no need to explain himself. When he reached the gate for his flight to New York, he stepped into the priority boarding line, first class. He handed over his ticket without a word, his name printed plainly on the boarding pass, Keanu Reeves. Behind the gate desk stood Lena, a flight attendant in her early 30s, polished and efficient. Her uniform was pristine, her posture straight-backed, her expression the kind of pleasant neutrality she'd been trained to maintain. But as she scanned his ticket, a flicker of uncertainty passed across her face. She looked from the name to the man in front of her, then back at the name. A pause. Sir?" she said, gently but with just a hint of hesitation. "This is the first-class boarding lane." Keanu offered a small, patient smile. "Yes, it is." She blinked. Confused for only a second longer, she looked down at the boarding pass again. The seat number was correct, the flight was correct, and the name, yes, it was unmistakable. She knew the name. Everyone did. But the man in front of her didn't look like a movie star. He looked regular. For a moment, Lena said nothing. Then she cleared her throat, forced a smile, and nodded him through. "Welcome aboard." He inclined his head politely and walked down the jet bridge, his silver crucifix shifting lightly against his chest. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Something about him stayed with her. Not his fame, she wasn't starstruck. It was something else, something that stirred beneath the surface. As Keanu settled into seat 2A, he did so with practiced ease. His movements were quiet, measured. He placed his duffel under the seat, buckled his seatbelt and leaned back, hands resting calmly on his thighs. He didn't pull out a phone or magazine. He just sat. Lena watched from the galley. Her eyes, though subtle, were fixed on him more than she realized. Something about him was out of sync with the setting. First class was tailored suits, glossy shoes, expensive watches. First class was clean, controlled, curated. And yet here sat a man with scuffed sneakers and a cross around his neck. Her gaze fell on that cross now. It wasn't gaudy or oversized. It didn't demand attention. But somehow, it held presence. The crucifix rested just below his collarbone. It moved with his breath, catching the light every now and then. Not bright, but enough to be noticed. Lena couldn't look away, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, it made her uncomfortable. The discomfort wasn't sudden, it was slow, creeping, a vague unease that sat in her stomach like turbulence before takeoff. She told herself it was protocol. She told herself it was about consistency, decorum, passenger perception. She told herself it wasn't personal, but she couldn't deny what she felt. The simplicity of his appearance, the confidence in his stillness, the way the crucifix sat quietly over his heart as if it belonged there, not as an accessory, but as part of him. Something about it challenged her. Not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with truth. Truth that needed no words, no defense. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled her most. As the last passengers boarded and the flight crew began final checks, Lena took a steadying breath, squared her shoulders, and walked forward, towards seat 2A. Something inside her had already made a decision, though she hadn't quite admitted it to herself. This wasn't about a necklace, at least not entirely. It was about what the necklace represented, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face that. But she was going to try. Keanu sat quietly in his seat as the plane ascended, its hum vibrating through the cabin like a soft lullaby. Around him, first-class passengers shifted into relaxation, earbuds in, seats reclined, tablets glowing. But he didn't reach for a screen, a book, or even a drink. He simply breathed, present, grounded. The small silver crucifix resting against his black t-shirt remained visible, unmoved. It wasn't polished to a shine or displayed with vanity, it just was. Weathered by time, a little dull at the edges, yet firm in its presence. It rose and fell gently with every breath he took, quietly announcing itself, not as a statement, but as a part of him. From the front galley, Lena watched again. She wasn't watching like a fan or a flight attendant ensuring passenger comfort. She was watching like someone who had begun to feel something she didn't want to name. Discomfort. Not loud, not dramatic, but gnawing. It was the necklace. She tried to rationalize it, told herself it wasn't about religion, not really. It was about policy, about professionalism, about maintaining a neutral environment in a premium cabin. That's what they called it during training. No visible slogans, no overt symbols, no attire or accessories that could trigger discomfort in others. Still, she hesitated. Her heart beat a little faster as she glanced down the aisle again. Most passengers were reclined or distracted, but he wasn't. He was still sitting upright, as if waiting. The crucifix remained in view. Lena smoothed her uniform, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and walked forward. Her steps were crisp, calculated. She stopped just beside seat 2A, her voice pitched low, gentle but firm. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her tone lined with forced warmth. "I hope you're comfortable so far." He turned to her. Calm. "Yes, thank you." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just wanted to mention, this is a premium cabin and we do ask passengers to avoid visible expressions that could be polarizing." She gestured vaguely toward his chest, not pointing directly, but her meaning was unmistakable. Keanu looked down at the crucifix, then back up. "Is there a problem with my necklace?" "It's not a problem," she replied quickly. "It's just, we try to maintain a neutral space. Some passengers have sensitivities when it comes to religious symbols." There was no hostility in her voice, but there was something colder, something trained, a kind of false politeness that stung more than open criticism. Keanu didn't blink. His voice remained soft, steady. "I've worn this on every flight I've taken for over 20 years. It's never been an issue." Lena nodded. "And I understand that, really. But with shifting guidelines and recent feedback from passengers, we've been encouraged to minimize any strong expressions, ideological, religious, or political, just to keep things as inclusive as possible." "Inclusive?" Keanu echoed quietly. Then his eyes lifted to meet hers. "By asking someone to hide part of who they are?" She shifted uncomfortably. "It's not personal. Then what is it?" There was no edge in his voice, no heat, and yet something in it pierced straight through. Lena faltered, just for a second. "We're just trying to prevent discomfort." He tilted his head slightly. "Are you uncomfortable?" She started. But the answer didn't come. Instead, she straightened. "If it's not too much trouble, perhaps you could just tuck it in? Out of respect for the cabin guidelines?" Keanu's eyes didn't leave hers. He reached up slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the cross. Then he paused and let his hand fall. "This isn't jewelry," he said gently. "This crucifix has been with me through the worst nights of my life. It's not a decoration, it's a reminder of grace, of survival." Lena swallowed. Her professionalism wavered for the briefest moment. "I see. Still, we might need to escalate this to the captain if there's a non-compliance concern." Keanu gave a quiet nod. "Do what you need to do. But know this," he added, voice even lower now, yet louder than anything else in the cabin. "The problem isn't what's on my chest. It's what you've been taught to see when you look at it." Silence. The kind that doesn't just pause a conversation, but shifts the air. Lena blinked, lips parting slightly, but no words came. He wasn't accusing, he wasn't grandstanding. He was just standing. On truth, on memory, on something unshakable. The couple seated across the aisle looked up. One of them subtly lowered their headphones. Another man, 3 rows back, leaned forward slightly. The crucifix hadn't moved, but the energy in the cabin had. Lena cleared her throat and stepped back, nodding stiffly. "I'll give you a moment." She turned and walked back to the galley, but something had already broken open inside her, and she couldn't close it again. Keanu remained seated, still, peaceful. He wasn't defiant, but he also wasn't afraid. His fingers lightly touched the crucifix again, as if to steady himself, or maybe just to remember what it had seen with him. The war zone in Syria where he'd prayed before stepping off a battered convoy truck. The hospital room in Vancouver where his sister fought through the night and lived. The alley in New Orleans where a man with a gun changed his mind when Keanu spoke to him, not with fear, but with presence. No, he wouldn't hide this. Not here, not now. Outside, the sun dipped beneath the clouds as the plane leveled into cruising altitude. Inside, the cabin was cool, polished, silent. But in seat 2A, something had been made clear. Some boundaries aren't drawn to divide. Some are drawn to define who we are. And when someone asks you to erase them, politely, professionally, quietly, what you do next reveals everything. Keanu had made his choice. And as the flight carried on, that choice was about to shake more than just one cabin. Would echo, because courage in silence speaks louder than commands in uniform. And the moment had only just begun. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin like a whisper, steady and neutral. But the air between seat 2A and the galley had shifted. Tension didn't shout in moments like these. It crept in slowly, like fog, clouding judgment and quieting reason. Lena stood near the galley, arms crossed, trying to maintain control over her own breathing. She had handled irate passengers. She had navigated emergencies mid-air, but somehow the quiet firmness in Keanu Reeves's voice had shaken something deeper. It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. It made her question whether she'd crossed a line, and that was not a place she liked to be. She picked up the service tablet and pretended to check cabin logistics, but her eyes kept drifting back to seat 2A. Keanu hadn't moved. He wasn't looking at anyone. He just sat there, a still point in a moving world, the small silver crucifix glinting gently in the dim cabin light. Jasmine, the co-attendant on duty, approached from the rear of the cabin. Younger, newer, but sharp, she stopped beside Lena, lowering her voice. "Everything okay up here?" Lena nodded quickly, too quickly. "Just a small issue. Passenger non-compliance?" Jasmine glanced down the aisle. "With who?" "2A," Lena said. Jasmine's eyebrows lifted. "Keanu Reeves? He's refusing to conceal a religious symbol." Jasmine paused, clearly puzzled. Is that against policy? Lena bristled. We encourage neutrality in premium cabins. We've had complaints in the past. Jasmine said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, has anyone complained now? Silence. Lena hesitated. She hadn't received a single comment, not a whisper. But she had felt something. Her own unease, her own assumptions. It had felt like policy at the time. It's about precedent, she said. We let one person do it, others follow. Jasmine didn't push, but the look in her eyes said enough. Down the aisle, 2 passengers had noticed the stir. A middle-aged couple, dressed business casual, angled slightly in their seats. The woman whispered something to her husband, who glanced toward the front and subtly turned his phone sideways on the armrest, the camera lens now facing down the aisle. They weren't alone. In row 3, a young man in a hoodie tapped his screen, switching from a podcast to the camera app. He didn't raise it, just let it roll silently on the tray table. The tension wasn't loud, but it was building, and eyes were watching. Lena stepped forward again. Keanu looked up as she approached. No hostility, no smugness, just calm. She took a breath, then spoke more formally this time. Mr. Reeves, as a representative of this airline, I'm formally requesting that you conceal the necklace. He didn't blink. Is that an official policy? She paused. It's part of our guidelines for maintaining a neutral passenger environment. He leaned forward slightly. Is it written anywhere that a crucifix must be hidden? Her silence betrayed her. Keanu's voice softened, but it carried. Then it's not policy, it's preference. Lena's composure cracked just slightly. If you continue to disregard this request, I'll be forced to escalate. Call whoever you need to, he replied. But understand, it's not what's on my chest, it's what's in your eyes. The line landed like a tremor. Behind Lena, Jasmine blinked. In row 2C, the businessman lifted his phone a little higher, subtle, but not hidden. The couple across the aisle exchanged glances again. The woman whispered, "He's not even being loud. Why is she pushing it?" Lena turned away from the seat and marched to the front galley. She grabbed the interphone, thumb hovering above the button that would patch her into the cockpit. "Are you sure about this?" Jasmine asked, her voice careful. "It's a matter of control," Lena said, almost more to herself than to her colleague. "We have to maintain order. He wasn't causing disorder. That's not the point. Then what is?" Lena's lips parted, but no answer came. In the cockpit, Captain Morales was reviewing flight data when the chime from the interphone sounded. He picked up. "Yes?" Lena's voice came through, measured but tense. "Captain, we have a situation in first class. Passenger is refusing a crew request." "What kind of request?" "He's wearing a religious item, visibly." A pause. "And?" "I asked him to conceal it. He declined." "Is he disruptive?" "No, sir." "Aggressive?" "No." "Then what's the emergency?" Lena hesitated again. Her voice faltered. "It's becoming a situation." Captain Morales was silent for a long beat. Then, "I'll be there shortly." Meanwhile, in seat 2A, Keanu remained still. He could feel the shift, the air thickening, the ripple effect of standing calmly in the face of pressure. He hadn't meant to cause a scene, but sometimes silence created its own kind of noise. He rested his hand over the crucifix and closed his eyes. Across the aisle, another phone lifted discreetly. Jasmine approached. She crouched slightly beside Keanu's seat, voice low. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves. This isn't how it should have gone." He opened his eyes. "You don't have to apologize for her." Jasmine nodded. "Still, I just want you to know. I see it, the way you've handled this." He offered a gentle nod. And then, the cockpit door opened. Captain Morales stepped into the aisle, calm as ever. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scan the cabin like an authority figure. He simply walked to the row, stopping beside Lena. He straightened, expecting backup, but he turned to Keanu first. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "may I have a moment?" Keanu nodded. I understand there's been some concern about a symbol you're wearing. Yes. Would you mind sharing with me what it means to you? Keanu looked up, eyes steady. It's not decoration, it's memory. A promise I made when I lost someone I loved. I don't wear it for others. I wear it because it reminds me of who I still want to be. Captain Morales nodded. Has he raised his voice? The captain asked, turning to Lena. She shook her head. Broken any rules? No, sir. Then I think we let the necklace be. Lena opened her mouth to object, but stopped, because now the cabin was watching, and silence had already told the story. The air in the first-class cabin had thickened, not with turbulence, but with tension. Keanu Reeves sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap, the small silver crucifix resting gently on his chest like it had for years. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't reacted with indignation. But the world around him was reacting. Lena stood near the galley, her lips tight, arms crossed and mind spiraling. She hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from someone so serene. His silence unnerved her more than any protest could have. It wasn't just non-compliance, it was a mirror. Passengers continued pretending not to watch, but eyes flicked, fingers tapped record buttons. Some sensed something real was unfolding. Even Jasmine, Lena's co-attendant, had gone quiet, standing a few feet back, her brow furrowed as she observed both her colleague and the man in seat 2A. Keanu slowly leaned forward in his seat, his voice soft but clear. This crucifix, he began, is not about ideology. It's not a costume or a statement. It's a part of me. He spoke like a man telling a secret, not seeking attention but giving witness. I've worn it through war zones, not literal ones, he added, glancing at Lena with empathy, but personal ones. Grief, loneliness, loss. The cabin, once buzzing with distraction, now hovered in suspended stillness. There was a hospital room once. I didn't think I'd wake up. There was no family left, no noise, just that little cross against my skin. And it reminded me to breathe. He touched it briefly with 2 fingers, as if checking it was still there. Not for the passengers, but for himself. I don't wear it to divide, he continued. I wear it to remember. A man 2 rows back, mid-60s, wearing a worn veteran's cap, sat straighter. He cleared his throat. If that's wrong, the man said, his voice gravelly, then I guess I was wrong too. Every time I kissed my dog tag before going into a firefight. Lena turned toward him, startled. The man wasn't smiling, he wasn't smirking, just stating a fact, one she couldn't deflect. Another woman spoke up softly. My mother died, holding her rosary. She said it helped her feel close to her own mom. Lena's jaw tightened. This was no longer about just one passenger. The cabin had shifted. Captain Morales appeared quietly, walking down the aisle with the practiced poise of a man who'd seen storms both inside and outside the cockpit. Mid-50s, steady gaze, trimmed mustache, and the calm that only thousands of flying hours could teach. He approached the aisle. What's the issue? Lena straightened immediately, formality returning like armor. Sir, the passenger in 2A has refused to comply with a request to conceal religious symbolism. I explained it could cause discomfort to others in the cabin. Captain Morales turned to Keanu, then looked briefly at the silver cross. Did you raise your voice, Mr. Reeves? Keanu shook his head gently. No, sir. Did you disrespect any crew member? No, sir. Morales turned to Lena. Did he disrupt the cabin? Lena hesitated. No. But he refused the request. Morales glanced around. He saw the veteran's narrowed eyes, Jasmine's conflicted expression, the phones discreetly recording. And then he saw Keanu, sitting, still, composed, his hands resting calmly, his shoulders relaxed. No anger, just presence. I see no disruption here, Morales said. I see a man wearing a necklace." Lena looked ready to protest. "But the atmosphere changed," the veteran cut in, "when he was judged for it." Captain Morales nodded slowly. "Then let's fix that." He turned to Keanu. "You're welcome to wear it, Mr. Reeves." "Thank you," Keanu replied simply. But the moment didn't end there. Keanu looked up at Lena, not with victory, but with quiet compassion. "You weren't trying to be cruel, I know that, but sometimes we mistake control for safety." Lena blinked, the words pierced. "I've lived most of my life quietly," he added, "because I've seen what noise can do. But silence, when it's filled with judgment, can be just as loud." The veteran looked down, hands clasped over his knee, nodding. Captain Morales clapped a hand on Lena's shoulder. "Let this be what it is, a moment, and a chance to learn." She didn't speak, but for the first time, she didn't need to defend herself. The armor was slipping. As Morales walked back to the cockpit, Keanu sat back in his seat. The crucifix stayed in place. No one asked him to move it again. Passengers resumed their movies. Drinks were poured. But the atmosphere had changed once more, this time with weight and respect. And all Keanu had done was speak his truth. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to be felt in the pressurized silence between rows. The low hum of the engines now felt like background to something far more human. A confrontation that didn't involve shouting, didn't erupt in chaos, yet held the weight of a courtroom verdict. Lena stood near the galley, her back straight, arms stiff against her sides. She had radioed the cockpit 5 minutes ago, requesting the captain's presence. Her words had been formal: passenger non-compliance, visible symbol, escalating discomfort. Yet even as she spoke them, some part of her chest tightened. She didn't feel victorious, she felt cornered. Jasmine, the younger flight attendant who had witnessed the exchange, stood several feet behind her, glancing nervously between Lena and the front row, where Keanu still sat in seat 2A, unmoved. His silver crucifix rested above his chest, undisturbed by the turbulence that seemed to shake only the people around him. Passengers had started whispering. One woman held her phone low, camera angled toward the aisle. A man near the window had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Everyone was paying attention now, not just to Keanu, but to the energy shifting in the air. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Morales stepped into the cabin. He didn't storm or scold. He simply walked forward with the calm presence of a man who had logged thousands of hours in the air and seen nearly every kind of human behavior at 35,000 feet. He wore no hat, just a composed face etched with experience. Early 50s, salt and pepper hair, eyes like slate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said gently, stopping near the first row. "Excuse the brief interruption." Lena stepped forward immediately. "Captain," she said, quiet but urgent, "the gentleman in seat 2A is refusing to comply with a reasonable cabin request. I asked him to conceal a religious symbol that could be considered inflammatory by some passengers. He's declined, even after I repeated the request." Morales looked at her but didn't speak right away. He then turned his head and looked at Jasmine, who had remained behind. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but as if searching for something underneath the spoken narrative. "Jasmine," he said evenly, "you were present?" Jasmine nodded. Her voice was soft. "Yes, sir." Mr. Reeves didn't raise his voice. He wasn't disrespectful. He just didn't want to hide something that's clearly important to him. The captain said nothing for a moment, then turned and stepped forward, stopping right in front of Keanu's seat. He offered a quiet nod, then crouched slightly to speak at eye level. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Captain Morales. Would you mind telling me what happened from your perspective?" Keanu looked up. His face was composed as always, but there was something behind his eyes, something old and unwavering. He didn't rush to speak. "She asked me to hide my necklace," he said calmly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Said it might make others uncomfortable. I told her I couldn't do that." The captain glanced down at the crucifix, then back to Keanu. Is it a symbol of your faith? It's a symbol of survival, Keanu said. It's something I've worn through things I wouldn't wish on anyone. I don't wear it for show, I wear it because it reminded me to keep going, and it still does. The captain exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he stood and turned to Lena. Did Mr. Reeves raise his voice at any point? Lena hesitated. No, Captain. Did he threaten you, use inappropriate language, disrupt the cabin? No, she said again, more quietly this time. The silence in the cabin deepened. It wasn't the silence of suspense, it was the silence of clarity. Captain Morales turned toward the passengers and slowly raised his hand to the intercom button. His voice came over the cabin speakers a moment later, even and firm. To all passengers on board, this flight upholds values of respect, dignity, and freedom of personal belief. There is no policy in this airline requiring any passenger to conceal personal symbols of faith, so long as they are not threatening or disruptive. Mr. Reeves is in full compliance with our standards. There was a pause, then he added, If you ever find yourself uncomfortable in the presence of someone's quiet faith, I suggest you examine whether it's the symbol you fear or the mirror it holds. The message wasn't just a clarification, it was a reckoning. The cabin remained still for several seconds. Then, softly, someone clapped. A single pair of hands. Then another. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Lena stood still, face drained of color. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She was stunned. Jasmine touched her elbow gently. Maybe we need to sit down for a minute. Keanu remained in his seat. He hadn't asked for validation. He hadn't delivered a speech, but something about the moment had turned. He wasn't just a man in a seat anymore. He was a symbol of something bigger. A man 2 rows back, grizzled mid-60s, stood briefly, steadying himself against his seat. I served 2 tours, he said, voice low but steady. That cross, I wore one too. You don't ask a man to hide that. He didn't wait for a reply. He sat back down. The captain gave a final nod to Keanu, then turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Jasmine followed, leaving Lena standing alone in the aisle. She turned toward Keanu once more. Their eyes met. There was no gloating in his gaze, no satisfaction, just steadiness. Truth. I just wanted to fly in peace, Keanu said gently. Lena blinked, the edge finally breaking in her voice. I thought I was doing my job. Maybe you were, he replied, but sometimes the job isn't about control. It's about seeing people. She didn't respond, just nodded, stepped aside, and walked toward the back of the cabin. By the time the plane touched down at LAX, what happened in seat 2A was already starting to ripple beyond the cabin walls. At 35,000 feet, it had been a quiet confrontation, one without raised voices, without a meltdown or viral outrage. But it was precisely that calm, the unwavering stillness of it, that made it echo louder than turbulence ever could. As passengers began disembarking, phones lit up with notifications. Clips, brief but telling, were already circulating. A short video, just 57 seconds long, showed Keanu Reeves seated, his crucifix plainly visible, and the quiet exchange between him and the flight crew. Another showed Captain Morales addressing the cabin with his dignified voice, affirming the right to wear personal expressions of faith. The first headline hit before Keanu even left the airport. Keanu silences a plane without saying a word. Within hours it was trending. Twitter exploded first, then YouTube, then the blogs. Some praised his poise, others dissected the symbolism. Even people who weren't religious found themselves captivated by the moment, not because of the crucifix alone, but because of how calmly it was defended. It didn't take long for mainstream media to pick up the story. News outlets pushed notifications. Actor Keanu Reeves, confronted for wearing crucifix mid-flight, responds with grace. Respect takes flight. Keanu's quiet stance goes viral. By morning, millions had seen it. Lena, the flight attendant at the center of the event, woke to a world very different than the one she left before takeoff. Her phone was flooded. Some messages were cruel, others were confused. A few were deeply reflective, but the judgment had begun, and it was merciless in its speed. What surprised everyone most, however, was what Keanu didn't do. He didn't make a statement condemning Lena. He didn't demand accountability from the airline. He didn't even grant interviews. Instead, just after noon, a quiet message appeared on his official page. Black text on a plain white background. No hashtags, no drama. Just his words. Grace is not weakness, it's strength with humility. I carry this cross not to be seen, but to remind myself that being seen is not the goal. We all carry something. Before we judge what's visible, we should remember what's invisible. Peace to those who rush to speak, and to those who choose silence instead. That was all, nothing more. Yet it was enough to shift the tone of the public conversation. The media headlines softened. The internet, which had briefly turned into a battlefield of hot takes, began to cool into something else: introspection. People began sharing their own stories. One woman posted, "I wore a tiny Star of David on a necklace once, and someone told me to take it off during a company Zoom call. I didn't, but I was scared the whole time." Watching Keanu sit so still and yet hold that line, it gave me courage I didn't know I needed. A young man commented, "You don't have to be religious to understand that identity is deeply personal. It's not about a symbol, it's about permission to be." Veterans weighed in too. One former Marine tweeted, "Keanu's right, that crucifix. I've seen it on dog tags, in boots, clutched in foxholes. It's not jewelry, it's armor." As the wave continued, a new headline appeared on multiple platforms. Keanu's necklace isn't about religion, it's about humanity. And still Keanu said nothing else. He went about his life quietly, as he always had. No press conferences, no victory lap. When photographers caught a glimpse of him 2 days later at a charity bookshop event, he wore the same thing: jeans, an old jacket, worn-out sneakers, and the crucifix. Still visible, still unapologetic. As for Lena, her experience unfolded in a different kind of spotlight. The airline released a generic statement: "We value inclusion, personal expression, and dignity for all travelers. We are reviewing the matter internally." It didn't name her, but she felt the weight regardless. For a few days, she avoided social media. She didn't answer calls. Then, on the 4th night after the flight, she did something she hadn't done in years. She sat alone in her small kitchen, lit only by the soft amber glow of a table lamp, and wrote a letter. It wasn't addressed to the airline or to the media. It was addressed to Keanu Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't see you at first, not really. I saw a man in sneakers, in silence, and something in me wanted to protect the cabin from something I couldn't name. But that wasn't your burden, it was mine. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't shame me, and still you held a mirror up that I couldn't look away from. You reminded me that dignity doesn't need a microphone, it only needs truth. Thank you." Lena. She never knew if he received it, she didn't need to. The days passed, then a week, then 2. The viral moment became a conversation piece, a think piece, a documentary teaser. But Keanu remained who he was from the beginning: quiet, steadfast, unchanged. The crucifix, now known to millions, became more than a symbol. It became a story, a reminder that stillness can be a statement, that you don't have to shout to be heard, that sometimes a single choice, like choosing not to hide, can speak louder than any argument ever could. In one final twist of irony, a major airline approached Keanu's team, requesting to use his image in a campaign about empathy in flight. He declined, but he did make one small request: that a portion of their campaign budget go toward buying books for underserved schools. The campaign was never made, but the books were bought. And in one small elementary school library in Detroit, a 5th grade girl picked up a copy of The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse, and found a note tucked inside the front cover. Your story matters, even if you tell it without words. K.R. The days after the flight didn't just belong to algorithms and headlines. Something deeper was happening, a shift that didn't scream, didn't trend at the top for long, but moved slowly through boardrooms, living rooms, classrooms, and conversations over coffee. The crucifix that Keanu wore hadn't changed. It was still the same, simple, slightly aged, dull at the edges. But to many, it no longer looked like just a religious pendant. It looked like something more, a quiet rebellion against performative tolerance, a gentle reminder that grace could be louder than outrage. One of the first ripples came from inside the aviation industry itself. While no airline made a dramatic public statement, behind closed doors memos were being passed around. Neutrality policy in premium cabins was suddenly under review. Internal emails began circulating among corporate departments with subject lines like policy versus perception, rethinking customer inclusion, language. One training director at a major airline said anonymously to a journalist, "We've always emphasized professionalism, but watching someone like Keanu stand so still, so respectful, and still get questioned, it made us realize our rules might be silencing the wrong people." Some airlines quietly updated their flight attendant training modules. A new slide was added to sensitivity training. Expression of faith, when non-disruptive, should never be assumed to be a threat to comfort. It was subtle, but it mattered. Meanwhile, Lena, the flight attendant at the center of the moment, had stepped down temporarily. The airline offered her a paid leave under the guise of public safety concerns, but everyone understood what it really meant. She needed space. And perhaps reflection. At first, Lena resisted the headlines. The online backlash stung, of course, but it wasn't the trolls that cut the deepest. It was the silence from her coworkers, the shift in how people looked at her. She had never considered herself intolerant. She had always prided herself on being composed, fair, and calm. And yet, she had seen something in Keanu that day, something that unsettled her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it held a peace she didn't understand. Weeks later, she sat in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, anonymous in her sweater and jeans, and reread the transcript of Captain Morales's words on the flight. "We are committed to the freedom to express one's faith without fear or shame." She remembered how it felt when he said that, like something inside her had cracked, not violently, but deeply. She didn't understand it at the time, but now she did. She hadn't been defending the airline that day. She had been defending her discomfort. And Keanu had never met that discomfort with punishment, only clarity. Lena began journaling again, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. At first, the pages were defensive, but slowly, the defenses gave way to something else: humility. 3 months after the flight, she posted a video on a small blog she created. She titled it, "Facing Myself at 35,000 Feet." She spoke, not with tears, not with PR polish, but with honesty. "I thought I was being professional. What I was really doing was projecting. I saw a symbol and let my discomfort define how I treated a person. That crucifix didn't shout, but it spoke, and what it said was something I couldn't ignore anymore." She paused. "I'm not who I was before that flight, and honestly, I hope I never will be again." The video quietly reached over 2 million views in 3 weeks. Emails began to pour in, not just from supporters, but from people across the spectrum, religious and not, conservative and liberal, believers and skeptics. One message read, "I don't wear a cross, but I've been made to feel like I needed to hide parts of myself to belong. Watching you own your mistake gave me the courage to stop apologizing for who I am." Another, "It's rare to see someone grow in public and not make excuses. You didn't just apologize, you transformed. That's real." Lena didn't respond to every message, but she read them all. As for Keanu, he never publicly responded to Lena's video. But one day, a small package arrived at her apartment. No return address, just her name on a handwritten card. Inside, a first edition copy of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. A yellow sticky note tucked inside the front cover bore a single sentence. "Stillness teaches, keep listening." Lena wept when she read it. Meanwhile, the crucifix, unintentionally now one of the most recognized pieces of jewelry in the world, became a symbol not of conflict, but of conviction. In the weeks that followed, more and more people began sharing photos online of their own quiet symbols. Crosses, stars of David, crescents, prayer beads, even stones from rivers long since left behind. They weren't flaunting. They were simply saying, "This is part of who I am. I won't hide it." Veterans wrote in too. One Marine, a double amputee from Texas, posted, "I carried a tiny crucifix sewn into the lining of my vest through 2 tours. Not because I wanted attention, but because I needed courage. Seeing Keanu wear his like armor gave me flashbacks." Good ones. A retired nurse from Iowa shared, "We've become so afraid of offending, we've forgotten how to coexist. That man reminded us that presence can be powerful, even when it's silent." A theology professor in Chicago published an op-ed titled "The Theology of Restraint," referencing Keanu's response as a masterclass in emotional intelligence and integrity. Perhaps most striking of all was a letter sent to a children's interfaith charity in New York, a modest organization serving children from Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and non-religious families. It was a bank-certified check. No sender, no note, just a donation of $250,000, anonymously marked, "In honor of peace in presence." The board director, upon reviewing surveillance footage at the Dropbox station, confirmed the donor, Keanu Reeves. He refused to comment. A week later, a handwritten thank you card was posted to the charity's website, penned by a 10-year-old girl named Amina. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I don't know why people told you to hide your necklace, but I'm glad you didn't. I wear a little bracelet with my grandma's name on it. I don't want to take it off either. My grandma says real courage is being kind when someone is mean. You were kind, so thank you." And so, the ripples continued. Not because someone shouted, but because someone didn't. And in that silence, millions heard something real, something worth remembering. The apartment was quiet. The early morning light filtered through pale curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the walls. On a small table in front of a second-hand bookshelf sat a single item, a silver crucifix, aged and worn around the edges, resting gently on a folded linen cloth. Lena sat across from it, barefoot, her knees pulled slightly toward her chest on a fabric-covered couch. Her phone was propped up on a stack of old paperbacks, the front camera reflecting a very different version of the woman who once strode down airplane aisles in heels and perfect posture. Today, there was no uniform, no winged name tag, no hairstyle lacquered into position. She wore a plain, slate-gray t-shirt and no makeup. Her hair was tucked behind her ears, natural and simple. Her voice, when she finally pressed record, came low, clear but gentle. There was no script, no team behind the camera. Just her, speaking from the first place she had allowed herself to, honesty. "Hi, I'm Lena, and if you're watching this, you probably already know why." She paused. "I was the flight attendant who asked Keanu Reeves to hide his crucifix." There was no flinch in her voice, just the kind of stillness that comes when a person stops defending what should never have been protected to begin with. It took me weeks to stop seeing that moment only through my own eyes. At first, I thought I was just doing my job, upholding policy, protecting cabin neutrality. But the truth is, she looked down for a moment, then back up. The truth is, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting my own discomfort. She glanced toward the table where the crucifix lay. Her fingers reached for it delicately, as though it might vanish if handled with anything less than care. "After the flight, he gave me this." She held it up toward the camera, not like a trophy, but like a story. No speech, no lecture, just this. Her thumb brushed gently along its side. "I've replayed that day 1,000 times. Not because of the backlash, not because of the headlines, but because of the silence. When I stood in front of him, trying to enforce something I didn't even fully understand, he didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he just saw me and said the one thing that stayed with me since. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with awe. She said, "The problem isn't what's on my chest, it's what's in your eyes." And I knew exactly what he meant. She let out a breath, not heavy, but cleansing. What was in my eyes that day wasn't policy, it was projection. It was fear disguised as professionalism. It was years of pressure to control everything, to make sure everyone around me felt safe, even if that meant asking others to hide who they were. The crucifix lowered gently into her palm, resting there like something fragile and earned. I thought hiding parts of yourself made you stronger, that if I could keep things neutral, I could avoid conflict. But neutrality isn't the same as peace. It's not even the same as respect. Another pause, but this one felt different, grounded. That flight changed me. Not because of what I did, but because of what I saw in him. Stillness. Strength. Not the kind you perform, but the kind that stands tall when no one else does. She set the crucifix down gently and folded her hands in her lap. When I told him to cover his necklace, I was really telling myself to stay small, to play it safe, to keep everything tidy and clean and correct. But what I've learned is that sometimes the mess, the discomfort, that's where truth lives. Her eyes welled, but she didn't wipe them. She let them speak. And the truth is, I don't want to be the person who hides anymore. For a moment, she didn't speak. The camera caught the rawness of someone not performing, not defending, just sitting in the echo of their own awakening. To everyone watching, I know you've seen people be attacked online, torn down, written off. I've seen it too, and maybe, in a different story, I would have deserved it. Her chin lifted slightly. But what Keanu gave me wasn't just grace. It was the space to face myself. She smiled. Not performative, just soft, just real. I used to think courage meant holding your ground. Now I think maybe it means letting go of what no longer fits. Another beat. So today, I'm not hiding behind a uniform, I'm not hiding behind policy, and I'm definitely not hiding from faith, even if it's not the same as his. She looked directly into the lens, her eyes clear. I don't wear this, she lifted the crucifix again, because I've converted to his religion. I wear it because it reminds me what it means to be human, to be seen, to be forgiven when I didn't deserve it, and to offer that same forgiveness to myself. Outside the window, a city moved in quiet motion. The world didn't stop, but something within her had. Thank you, Keanu, not for forgiving me, but for seeing me. I'll never forget it. She reached out, tapped the record button, and the screen dimmed. Later that evening, as the video made its slow, quiet way across the internet, shared not in rage but reverence, Lena sat beside the window, the crucifix still in her hand. She didn't post again that week. She didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't playing a role. She wasn't reciting a script. She was simply Lena, unhidden, unarmored, and free. By the time the world had watched Lena's video over 5 million times, the headlines had already moved on. The internet had its fill of outrage, then redemption. Articles came and went. Opinion pieces debated everything from religious freedom to professionalism in customer service. But Keanu Reeves said nothing more. He didn't retweet her message, didn't post a statement, didn't give interviews. When asked by a journalist outside a bookstore weeks later, he only smiled and said, "I think she found her answer. That's enough." And that was all. No tour, no panel, no brand partnership or public campaign, because that's what made it real, what made it matter. From the beginning, Keanu had never set out to make a scene. He didn't argue, he didn't demand, he didn't try to win the room. All he did was sit in quiet, anchored truth. While others measured strength and volume, he embodied something far more powerful: stillness. Not passivity, not fear. Stillness with weight. Stillness that could bear the scrutiny of a plane full of eyes and still not flinch. Stillness that called out judgment without cruelty, that invited self-reflection without shame. It wasn't silence to avoid discomfort, it was silence that revealed it. That moment, when Keanu met Lena's challenge not with confrontation, but with clarity, became more than a viral moment. It became a mirror, one people around the world didn't expect to look into, but couldn't turn away from. Some saw faith in it. Others saw dignity. But what united all of them was this: they saw a man who refused to hide what mattered to him, even when it would have been easier to shrink. A man who stayed rooted when most would have folded or lashed out. That's strength. Real strength isn't loud. It's not always charismatic. It doesn't always wear medals or shout the right slogans. Real strength, sometimes, looks like a silver cross on a black t-shirt. It looks like kindness in the face of insult. It looks like someone who chooses grace, even when no one's watching. That's the lesson. Don't hide what matters. Not just symbols, but your peace, your kindness, your stillness. Because somewhere along the way, the world convinced us that softness is weakness, that quiet means uncertain, that if we're not shouting, we're not strong. But Keanu reminded us otherwise. He showed us that stillness can be stronger than shouting, that presence can be more powerful than pressure, and that sometimes the most unforgettable voice in the room is the one that never raises. So, if someone questions your truth, your values, your dignity, you don't have to rage, you don't have to prove, you don't have to perform. Just be. Be unmoved, be clear, be kind. Because the strongest voices don't always echo. Some settle deep, quietly shaping the people around them long after the noise fades. And Lena? She won't forget that. Not because she was corrected, but because she was seen. Because someone met her resistance not with retaliation, but reflection. Keanu didn't cancel her. He didn't humiliate her. He left her with a choice: to hide behind fear or to face what lived in her eyes. She chose to face it, and that changed everything. That's the ripple of stillness. Not viral fame, not applause, but transformation. If you're still here, listening to this moment, maybe you've felt it too. The urge to hide your faith, your values, your gentleness, your story. The pressure to shrink because others might flinch. But let Keanu remind you, you are allowed to be whole. You are allowed to carry your story, to wear what means something to you, to speak without shouting, to hold ground without swinging fists. Because sometimes stillness isn't silence, it's strength. And now we leave you with this. In a noisy world that celebrates performance over peace, what would happen if we chose presence instead? If we wore our stories not for approval but for remembrance? If we offered others what Keanu offered Lena, not shame, but a chance to see differently? If we stopped hiding the things that anchor us just because someone else doesn't understand them? Imagine that world, a quieter one, a braver one, a kinder one. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more stillness that holds its ground, not in anger but in truth. So the next time someone asks you to shrink, to hide, to be less than who you are, remember this flight. Remember Keanu. Remember what strength can look like when it doesn't need to prove itself. If you believe stillness can be more powerful than shouting, drop 1 in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more powerful, true stories that remind us. It's not what's on your chest, it's what lives in your heart.